Welcome to the History Nerds United podcast. I am your head nerd, Brendan. Thank you so much for being here. Great episode today. Author Susan Casey, her book, The Underworld. We're talking about the deep sea. It's cold and cool and weird, and I love the book. I love talking to Susan. There's so much cool stuff we're going to talk about, and it's like not even 20% of the book. Should say, yeah, we're going to talk about Oceangate and the Titan. I know that just happened. Read the book before it happened, but then we did the interview after it happened. We're going to discuss that. That's going to be part of it, but we're really going to focus on how wonderful this book is. It's one of my favorite that I've read in like the past 6 months, and I've read a lot of books in the past 6 months. All right, I'm going to shut up. Let's get Susan on here. And here we are with author Susan Casey, The Underworld, Journeys to the Depths of the Ocean. Susan, thank you so much for coming on.
My pleasure, Brendan.
Susan, I have to say this. You know, I talk to a lot of other history nerds, right? And that's just like, I can see them coming a mile away. Your book, The Underworld, I need to see if you agree with this. You're an ocean nerd, 100%.
Oh, I'm totally. 100% an ocean nerd, 100%.
Because you live both in New York and Hawaii, right? I'm assuming that when you're in Hawaii, you're just in the ocean every day. Do you like sleep in there, or how's that work?
No. The ocean, it takes a lot out of you. I mean, I do like coming back to land to write, being a little bit more grounded. But yeah, I mean, I look out and see it, and I'm in it as much as I can be.
All right. So we know that you love the ocean, but what made you decide, the Underworld, we're talking the deep sea ocean, which you're going to have to explain the levels for us. But what made you decide that you wanted to write this book?
I think I've wanted to write about the deep ocean ever since my first book, which was about the sort of resident great white sharks that live at the Farallon Islands off the coast of California, like due west from the Golden Gate Bridge, about 30 miles. And when I was there, we would see these great white sharks, and the water is very black and kind of inscrutable. And we would see these great white sharks come to the surface and feed because they were hunting elephant seals, and the elephant seals would float. So the sharks would come to the surface and feed, and the scientists would come up in their little research boat and film them. And it was like, okay, so this 15-foot great white shark just comes up from below. And then on other days, there were multiple sharks. And one day there were 40 blue whales just lunge feeding. And when I was out there, I saw on any given day, something amazing would pop up from below, like a mako shark, or these really cool gelatinous creatures called ctenophores and siphonophores that are like comb jellies. And I never even knew they existed. And there was an urchin diver who still worked out there. He was the last guy who was willing to take his chances with the sharks, because there are a lot of sharks out there in the fall. And he told me that when he was down there, he saw shipwrecks. He saw a 9-foot tall anchor. One time he came up with a piece of the bottom in his hand and gave it to me. It was pink. And I just remember thinking, like, what's going on down there? Like, if you could go through the surface and you could see this parallel universe that's happening all the time, but we just don't see it, like, what would you see if you went down there? The notion that it could be anything that came to the surface made me ask the question of myself, okay, well, what else is down there? So I started thinking about it right from the beginning, but this is my fourth book about the ocean, and I'm glad that I waited this long because it's big, and there's a lot of stuff going on there, and there's a lot of different layers of it, and there's a lot of different sciences happening. And it took absolutely everything I learned in my other books to even be able to think about tackling this book. It started in the beginning, and it's been percolating now for, I guess, about 20 years.
Really, you highlight in this book for me, and let me ask you a direct question. How much of the actual ocean floor have we mapped?
At high resolution, about 25%. And it was 20% until very recently. If you go on Google Earth and you look, you can see the trenches and you can see the big features of the seafloor, but they're at pretty low resolution. And what happens is when they go with a high resolution sonar array and they go over an area with a ship, or say it could be a glider or something, but they take a high resolution sonar, you have to take it and actually physically go there. It's like putting the lens on the Hubble telescope. You see, all of a sudden you see mountains that weren't big enough to make it onto the low resolution bathymetry, which is, the undersea equivalent of topography. So every time they do that, they find stuff that we didn't no idea it was there. So there are a lot of things down there that we still have yet to be revealed. And they are hoping to have the entire seafloor mapped at high resolution by 2030. That's a really ambitious goal.
I mean, it's just a lot down there that like we don't see. And do me a favor, just explain to me, the dumb guy. So what are the levels of the ocean that we're talking about, right? Because number one, we're going to talk about, there's the top part, which we're not going to talk about sharks anymore because I'm going to Cape Cod in a few weeks. So they're not going to freak me out. So let's just jump deeper because I'll never go deeper. So we got the top. What do we call that? And then how far does it go down?
Yeah, that's the thing. What is the deep ocean anyway, right? So scientists argue it's enormous. Typically, it's described as, the water's below 600 feet, where the sunlight essentially stops. I mean, the blue wavelength percolates for another couple thousand feet, but it's the black, dark part of the ocean below 600 feet. The top 600 feet, 200 meters to 3,300 feet, 1,000 meters is the top layer of the deep ocean. And that is called the twilight zone or the mesopelagic zone. And then below that, there's another layer that is sometimes called the midnight zone or the bathypelagic zone. And that's like 1,000 meters to 3,000 meters. So for the purposes of round numbers, and in my book, I made it 3,300 to 10,000 feet. And then below that is the abyssal zone. And that is sometimes called the abyss. And that is the waters from 10,000 to 20,000 feet. And a lot of the Earth's seafloor is in the abyssal zone range. Like the waters above it are between 10,000 to 20,000 feet. But there is a deeper layer. The deepest layer of the ocean is called the Hadal zone, after Hades, the god of the underworld and the brother of Poseidon. And the Hadal zone is really interesting because it goes from 6,000 meters to 11,000 meters, or from 20,000 to 36,000 feet. So that's 45% of the depth of the ocean, but it is only 2% of the seafloor. So like as a footprint. So what makes the Hadal zone is when two tectonic plates collide and one plate subducts beneath another plate and starts to head back down into the mantle, and it creates a deep V-shaped trench. So one instance of that is the Mariana Trench that most people have heard of. It's 1,500 miles long and 44 miles wide. So it's a really long, narrow, steep trench. And it goes all the way down to the deepest point in the Mariana Trench is about 35,876 feet. That's called the Challenger Deep. So the Hadal Zone it's not everywhere. It's just in these seams between tectonic plates where they meet. But it does account for this huge amount of depth.
I mean, when we're talking about these types of feet, like you could drop Everest right into Challenger Deep pretty easily, right?
Yeah, 29,029 feet.
And still have some water left over.
Yeah.
So just going into the history of it, when did humanity really start to kind of get a little bit deeper other than just jumping in and diving as far down as you can? When did we really start to try to get into the deep ocean?
Well, so I read about this one expedition that happened in between 1873 and 1876. It was called the Challenger Expedition, and it really was the first global deep sea expedition, and it was done on a ship called the HMS Challenger. And those people on the Challenger, those scientists and those mariners that were on that ship, spent I forget, it's something like 68,000 nautical miles they sailed. They went everywhere, and what they did was they dredged the deep sea floor, and they brought it back up, and they looked at what they found. In some cases, larger animals, in some cases, smaller animals, microscopic animals even. They had a whole lab set up on their ship in Victorian form. They were completely breaking new ground everywhere they went. And what's really interesting about that is at the time that this was happening, there was this sense and a theory called the azoic theory that sort of held that nothing could live down there. The pressure, the temperature, it's probably freezing. Maybe the seafloor is sealed in ice. Maybe nothing lives down there. Maybe everything lives near the surface. And it sounds ridiculous to us now, but at the time it was really a serious theory that needed to be disproven. And so they went out to do that. And they did. They found life everywhere and at every depth. They actually made it to the Mariana Trench, and this is in the days before ocean mapping or sonar or anything like that. They ended up in some part of the Mariana Trench finding a really deep sounding, and they were really astonished by that. It was like, wow, this is really deep. And, it's just kind of astonishing to think that back then when they were doing it, like we had no idea what was down there, like none. And that wasn't that long ago.
I mean, it's also, I'm thinking about somebody's standing on there and they're trying to find out how deep it is, and somebody goes, "You've got to be doing this wrong. It can't go down that far. You're doing this wrong," and there's arguments on the ship and everything. I'm just assuming. We don't have documentation of it. But I'd have to think that they'd get down so far that somebody'd be like, "Something's wrong. It can't possibly be this deep."
Well, their methods for sounding, as you probably know, was to take a line with a weight on it and drop it and try to detect when it hit the bottom. So, I mean, I guess you can be assured that you're going to have a pretty straight line, but detecting when it hits the bottom through almost, 6 or 7 miles of water would be an art. I mean, I have to think that certainly, like, it would be hard to be able to, maybe the line starts pooling up at the top, or I don't know. It wasn't an exact science, but it was the best they had. And, I do know from reading that everybody who went on the Challenger account wrote a biography or published something. So there's like a tremendous amount of material about what it was like and what they went through. And people died on this expedition, several of them. And the sailors hated having to lower and raise the dredge every day, lower and raise all the instruments. There's a large amount of actual physical labor involved in everything that they did. And hauling this dredge up with this kind of a net with an iron jawed mouth, and it was heavy, and then it would spill all over the deck, and they would go through it, and the scientists would take stuff off to the lab. It was a lot of actual labor.
And now I want to get to chapter 2 of your book, because we're going to have to talk about a current event, but I read this before Oceangate happened. Chapter 2 by itself, without knowing anything, is like Stephen King level freaky. You start talking about the first humans going down there and what happens when you're in a vessel. Can you just talk a little bit about that? Like, because it's just anything could go wrong. There's weird sounds. There's all this stuff. Like, the first people who decided to get into a sphere and drop into the ocean, I mean, it was a while ago, and it's a scary situation, right?
Well, they, once again, like, nobody knew what would happen. These two men, Otis Barton and William Beebe, were the first two men to actually go into the deep physically, go below 600 feet. And they created their own craft to do this, which was they called the bathysphere. And what it was a 5-foot diameter hollow steel ball with 3 viewports cut into it and a hatch. Actually, I think aside from Oceangate, they were the ones who had the riskiest submersible because they also were bolted in. They were on a cable. So, of course, you've got this, I think it weighed 2 tons. They had to trust that nothing would happen, like the cable wouldn't detach from the winch or wouldn't detach from the hatch. And at the time, it was really like cutting edge industrial processes to create a steel cable that was wound strongly enough to do this. Their ultimate depth that they got to was around 2/3 of a mile. Little less, but they went down there, and at any moment, their viewports were made of glass. So nobody knew, okay, what's the pressure going to do to that glass? There was no guarantee that if something went wrong, let's say they detached, there was no way to get them back up. Nobody was coming to rescue them. And on several occasions, they had test dives where they sent the sphere down empty, and a viewport did blow out, and the thing came up filled with water. And there was another time where the cable got stuck on the spool, the winch that was pulling them in, and there was just chaos on deck, because what happens if, you've got all this tension on this cable? Like, how do you unstick it? They say in the book, luck played a greater role. Multiple dives that they made, like a couple dozen. And every time was like a spin of the roulette wheel, whether everything was going to be okay. But they did. They managed it. They got back to the surface. William Beebe wrote a hauntingly beautiful book about all the bioluminescent animals he had seen. And so it was groundbreaking what they did, but it was highly, highly risky.
Well, especially reading it before Oceangate, it was already freaky for me, because you talk about it, it's just, you're going to hear a sound and it's probably over, which unfortunately was prescient with what went on. But I mean, they were in this sphere. They didn't know what was going to happen. And then any sound, which there's going to be weird sounds anyway, like that was going to be normal, but also it could be, you'd have electrical wires, you can have anything, all of these things. What I'm saying is, I would never freaking do it. Under any circumstances, I'm going to stay on the beach.
Well, I would argue that you should rethink that, because manned submersibles are actually the safest statistically mode of transportation that we have. Prior to Oceangate, there was no fatality in a manned submersible since 1974, when there was an entanglement and they couldn't get them out in time. It is so safe. And even William Beebe and Otis Barton knew that you need to build a sphere for a pressure hull, because it's the only shape where the pressure of the deep, which is, tremendous, particularly at the depths of the Titanic, which is about 3,800 meters, you're dealing with 6,000 pounds of pressure per square inch. You need a sphere. Sorry if your business plan doesn't account for that, but the ocean doesn't care about your business plan. You're going to have to deal with 6,000 pounds per square inch, and a sphere is the safe way to do it. So yeah, there's a lot to say about Oceangate. It's a tragedy that didn't have to happen. It was a tragedy that was foreseen and foretold. And it was a tragedy that many, many people in the very small, tight-knit world of manned submersibles tried to prevent. But there you go. There's a reason for all these crazy safety rules that they have.
Before we jump into this, I do want to say that someone who was on the Titan is in your book, Paul Henry Nargeolet. Forget everything else. What do you remember about him? How should we remember him? Because he was, I believe, the pilot on the Titan, right?
No, Stockton Rush was the pilot and the creator of the Titan, and PH, as he is known, he's the world expert on the Titanic. And but let me back out and answer your very wonderful question, because PH was an incredible human being, and I appreciate a chance to talk about him. I met him when I joined an expedition called the Five Deeps in 2019. I got on the ship in Tonga. The submersible was a privately owned full ocean depth submersible that was extraordinary, hyper engineered for safety, fully certified, really incredible sub. And PH had been hired by the sub's owner, this businessman named Victor Vescovo, just to ride herd on, make sure that everything was going well in the build of the sub and the design of the sub, that everything was safe, because PH was in the top 3, if not the top, deep submergence pilot alive. He was so extraordinarily experienced. I got his professional biography before I got on the ship. It's 5 pages long, and it's just, the guy was such a badass. I mean, he was a commander in the French Navy. He was in charge of France's 6,000 meter sub, the Nautile, which is a very venerable sub that's been around for a while and done incredible ocean exploration. He was in charge of a demolitions team that cleared booby-trap bombs from Hitler's troops in World War II from the English Channel. He cleared the Suez Canal. He went down to find the black box from, I forget the name of the flight, but it was the one that went down off Brazil. He found the black box. He had spent more time underwater than anyone, and he loved the ocean, loved it. So I was a little intimidated when I met him, because he's a real icon. And yet was so humble and so lovely, and would just love to sit and talk about the ocean. And he particularly loved diving on volcanic vents. I asked him, what's your favorite place to dive? And he said volcanic vents. But the other place that he was inexorably drawn to in the deep ocean was the Titanic. And he had done the first manned dive after they found the Titanic in 1985. It was a joint French and American expedition that found it. The French weren't on site when it was found, so they felt like I think they felt a little bit like they got cut out of the credit. But it was together. And when it was decided that they were going to go down in a manned submersible, PH made the first dive with 2 other people, because the Nautile seats 3 people. And he would have been the pilot of that. And he had since been there more than 30 times when I met him in Tonga, and he loved to talk. He knew that ship, every inch of it. And he'd also piloted ROVs down the Grand Staircase. He had been all over it. And you could just see him sort of light up like a 10-year-old kid when he talked about it. But yeah, he was super fun, super laid back. Like, the guy's a rock star, and he was just so cool. Everybody loved PH. Everybody. He's going to be missed. And nobody could figure out what the hell he was doing on that submersible, because, if anybody knew its shortcomings, it was him. The only thing that anybody can think of is that he just was so drawn to the Titanic, because by the time he had finished his 30 or so dives, he knew so much about not just the ship, but the people who were on the ship. He knew the stories, the backstories, the histories, the people who survived, the people who didn't. He found a wristwatch on the seafloor and picked it up with a Nautile's manipulator arm, took it back to the surface, and figured out from the initials on the watch who the owner was on the ship, researched and found out that he had a living relative, and went to her house and gave it to her. That was the level of emotional involvement that he had with that. That was the way he could get back there, was with the Titan and Oceangate. And they did manage to get down there a few times. And when people said to him, PH, there are issues with this sub, that it's dangerous. And he just said, I think I can help them make it safer. But yeah, there really wasn't anything he could do. Maybe he did. Maybe he helped them from getting entangled in one of the 2 previous seasons, because the Titanic is known to be a really massive entanglement hazard. There's stuff sticking out everywhere. And even though there are ROVs that could go down to 4,000 meters and help with an entanglement, there's every chance that if you got entangled, they wouldn't get there in time, or like you just don't want to get entangled on the Titanic. So maybe he did. Maybe pH did help. But there was nothing that could help the fact that it was a cylindrical pressure hull made out of carbon fiber. Those are not the materials or the shape that can withstand 6,000 pounds of pressure per square inch safely. Carbon fiber is known to be unpredictable. That's why it's not used. The last thing in the world you want in your deep sea submersible is an unpredictable, potentially catastrophic failure with the material that it's built out of.
And yeah, I mean, your book goes into this, and obviously this was written way before this. I mean, I'll just say to listeners, if you want to understand more of the mechanics of why this shouldn't have been going into the ocean, literally just read chapter 2 of this book, because I didn't know any better other than reading your book. And then as soon as this happened and they said, we've lost comms, I went, uh-oh. I'm like, I don't know, but just reading this. Now, I will say, listen, there was a lot on social media. I'm going to leave that one alone. But something that your book kind of brings out that I think we do need to talk about is it's rich people in the ocean. Well, I think your book kind of points out you actually need people, wealthy patrons, to even make this possible to explore the ocean. When you started researching, how many vehicles even existed on Earth that could dive to the places that you wrote about in the book?
There weren't very many that could go below 6,000 feet. At the time of writing, I think there were about 8. And that's not that deep. But if you take 4,000 meters, you take the 3,800, 4,000 meters, the depth that the Titan was going to, there are only I think there are 6. China has 3. France has the Nautile. The U.S. has the Alvin, which can now go to 6,500 meters. Used to only be able to go to 4,000, but that's a big burly scientific sub, and they refitted it to go to 6,500 meters. So they're not that many. It's very expensive. The subs that I dived in, the ones that have gone through this really rigorous testing and certification program, and it's tested and certified every year, they have their own ships. They have their own climate-controlled hangars. They come with their own crew of at least 10 technicians. In the case of China's full ocean depth sub, which they dived for the first time while I was finishing my book, they have a crew of 80 people work on that sub and travel with it. It's huge. The idea of just tossing this thing onto a submergible landing platform and towing it 400 miles through the North Atlantic, and therefore you're going to have to do all your maintenance out at sea, and you're dealing with all the corrosiveness and the banging, and it's just very hard what they were doing. It didn't look good. It wasn't good. It was clear to, I would say, probably everybody in this very small, tight-knit world, the scientists, the manufacturers, the technicians that know about these vehicles, that this was a problem, a big one. And for years, actually, they knew this.
But at the same time, it's actually pretty important that you have these backers that are willing to spend a lot of money. Because as you just mentioned, there's a whole bunch of countries that don't even have anything that can dive, right? So for what you're talking about, the science, the fact that we don't know a lot about the deep sea, in order to even get down there, part of the whole process, part of the game here is that you have to have a wealthy patron who's willing to put out a lot of money to create this stuff, to pay for these expeditions. And as you already mentioned, like the ones you went out on, you had to have a wealthy patron. Otherwise, it wasn't going to happen at all, right?
Yeah. In some cases, it would be that, organizations like the National Science Foundation, or in the case of the Alvin, the U.S. Navy, and China has sponsored a lot of deep sea research. But yes, there are also ships like Victor Vescovo's sub, that Limiting Factor, that was a full ocean depth sub that I dived in. It had its own ship. It had its own crew. That's expensive. And he footed that bill. Wendy and Eric Schmidt from Google, they have the Falcor, and they have a really good ROV that goes to, I think it's 6,000 meters. And they take scientists all over the world. They pay for it. They fund so much ocean research and exploration. And when Paul Allen was alive, he funded a tremendous amount of search. They found dozens of really significant World War II shipwrecks, including the USS Indianapolis. So these are private individuals doing this. Ray Dalio and the Dalio Foundation has OceanX, which has 3 subs, a massive ship, takes media companies into the deep ocean so they can film it and bring it back and educate us about what's down there. So it's really important. And because there's so little exploration of the deep and it's so much a part of our planet. I mean, the planet as a biosphere is 98% ocean. 95% of that is deep ocean. So if we don't know the deep ocean, we don't know where we live. So whenever I hear people griping about old rich people's toys, I just think you're missing the bigger point. It's great that anybody does anything because we need all of this knowledge and it doesn't matter where it comes from. Anybody who wants to do this safely, I have to put that in large capital red letters because it wasn't doing a lot of favors to go down and have a catastrophic implosion at 3,700 meters. That's not what I'm talking about. But to go into the ocean with respect for the forces in the deep ocean, which requires you to obey engineering rules and math, and she does not negotiate on those. I'm happy when anybody does it.
Let's go back to the positive side of things, because this book is a love letter more than anything else. You got to dive twice. I want to hear about both of them. Just real quick, how deep? What was it like? How freaked out were you? Did you get to pilot one of them? Come on, tell us.
Okay, so when I first started the research for my book, I was looking around like, I do immersive journalism. I want to go into the environment that I'm writing about, and I really want to spend some time there. Well, how can I do this for the deep ocean? I was living in Hawaii at the time. I was living there full time at the time. And I was hanging out with the pilots at the Hawaii Undersea Research Lab, which had these two 2,000-meter subs called the Pisces 4 and the Pisces 5. Really, really cool subs that had been working in the Pacific for, I think close to 40 years, but, maintained meticulously and really still had many decades of service left. So I was just learning about submersibles, just learning about them. And while I was doing that, the university found out that they were going to have to make a huge investment in the support ship and didn't have the money, so they were going to have to take the Pisces out of service. And I had thought that I was going to get a chance to dive in the Pisces. It didn't look like I was going to. So I started looking around and I come across Oceangate. And I'm reading all this stuff and it sounds really good. Like this private company is building submersibles and they're going to take people. You can buy a ticket, you can go. So I set up a phone call with them and they told me about it wasn't built yet, the Titan, but they had all kinds of talk about it, it was going to be this revolutionary thing. And, they were absolutely going to be going this year. And this was in 2018. They didn't go till 2021. But I didn't know any of this, just all sounded good. But luckily, I was pretty connected to these people in Hawaii. I went back and I said, I think I might dive on this sub that's going to the Titanic. And they just looked at me and said, no, you can't. You cannot dive in that sub. And then they told me that if you really want to understand why, go to this Marine Technology Society annual meeting. So I went and I learned all about carbon fiber, and I heard from all these other, like everybody in the submersible world would go there. Everybody was very frightened of the prospect of this sub. And so since then, I had my eye on it and was just sort of hoping that something would happen where they wouldn't actually do it. And then when they did it, it was sort of like, well, what's pH doing there? And then they went for 2 years and it wasn't very smooth, but they did get people to the Titanic. And I think people just sort of forgot about it a little bit until this happened. So then here I am. I'm not going on Oceangate. I'm not going on the Pisces. Then I found out about Victor Vescovo's sub, the full ocean depth sub, was doing this incredible global expedition in 2019. So I requested to be allowed to accompany the expedition as part of my reporting, and they just said, come on, just join us. And I went. So it was incredibly fortuitous because there had never been a full ocean depth passenger sub that was certified and accredited and safe to dive repeatedly. Like James Cameron's sub went to the Mariana Trench's Challenger Deep. It was for him alone, and it was an experimental sub. Nobody else was going to get on that sub, and it wasn't capable of doing repeated dives. It only did that one dive, in fact. So this was a real groundbreaking sub. And it was just a beautiful piece of engineering. So I became really part of that crew. I wrote a magazine article about it as I was reporting, watched as they continued beyond the 5 deeps, and Victor Vescovo started exploring all these other hadal trenches and other deep areas. That went on for a few years. And somewhere along the line, I just said to him, hey, do you think I could dive with you sometime? And he said, yeah. Let's go to the Mariana Trench. And I was like, whoa, like I asked to go for a ride around the block and I'm going to the moon. And so It was the height of the pandemic. I couldn't barely sleep. I was so excited. I was just beside myself. I'm going to get to go. We weren't going to the Challenger Deep. We were going to go, to me, this was even more exciting. We were going to go to the part of the Mariana Trench that nobody had ever been before, but it's still almost 33,000 feet deep. It didn't have a name, but it was off of the island of Rota. So it would have been, we were just calling it shorthand, the Rota Deep, but it was in a different part of the Mariana Trench. So the way you get onto a ship to go out to the Mariana Trench is you go through Guam. So it was the height of the pandemic, and so many airports were closed down, and I'm like, oh my God, now I'm not going to get to go because of COVID. But a long story short, I made it to Guam. I was in the Honolulu airport. I was the only one in the Honolulu airport. And of course, the planes were still going to Guam because there's so much military activity there. So I think it was me and like 5 other people on the 777. I got there. They had arranged for us to go straight from the airport to the ship so we wouldn't have to quarantine for 2 weeks. And we got on the ship, and there was something wrong with the sub. It needed some electrical repairs that couldn't be done in the environment of the ship. It had to go back to Hawaii and be dry docked. So I went all the way to Guam, and then I turned around and went back and didn't get to dive in the Mariana Trench. But Victor said to me, don't worry, we're going to reschedule you. And when time came to do that in 2021, the sub was just coming back into the water in Hawaii. And he said, what do you think if we go to the Hawaiian Deep? These are my home waters. The deepest part of that is about 5,500 meters. So it's not as deep as the Mariana Trench, but it really meant a lot to me because that was where I really learned to love the ocean in all of its moods. That's where I wrote The Wave. I wanted to meet the Hawaiian Deep. I wanted to see this submarine volcano that will one day become the next Hawaiian island. So that is where we dove in Hawaii. I won't give away any more than that. It was sort of an interesting process to get that dive done. I'll let readers discover that, but it was amazing. And before that, I also dived in another Triton submersible. The company that built both of these submersibles is sort of the Apple of submarine design, really top notch, called Triton Submarines. And I dived in one of their subs that has an acrylic hull. So in the shallower depths, you can use acrylic, and it's great because it's like floating in a bubble, and you see life around you, like it's like you're in a psychedelic aquarium. So that was also majestic and fascinating and completely different because it was, we went to 3,300 feet, which is deep enough, but that's the band of the ocean called the Twilight Zone, where there are more animals in that particular band of the deep ocean than there are in all the other regions of the ocean combined, and they're all bioluminescent practically. So you're just falling through this rain of fireworks, and we landed on this really amazing place that, again, I'll let readers discover for themselves, but I was almost crying when I had to get out of the sub. I haven't felt that grief-stricken since my father died. It was really, really to me, the idea that maybe I would never get to do this again I could not process it. And I still hope that isn't the case.
I would have cried if you tried to put me in the sub, but we're just going to have to agree to disagree on whether or not I should be in a sub, neither here nor there. I want readers to really, discover that portion of it, but I am going to ask one follow-up on your dives. What is the coolest thing you saw down there, whether it was just a weird light or a fish? I'm going to go first. I loved reading about the ass fish because I didn't know there was a thing called an ass fish, and I have the sense of humor of a 13-year-old. So that was my favorite. What's yours?
Well, I'm not going to talk about my dives because I really do want readers to discover that for themselves, but I will tell you what is very cool, and it is actually the companion at hadal depths of the ass fish, and that is the hadal snailfish. And so the hadal snailfish is the most successful predator in the deep ocean. It's the deepest fish, and the ass fish is right there with it, but they haven't seen snailfish is slightly deeper. And the hadal snailfish is a pink fish with a big wide head, little tiny black button eyes, and a smiley mouth. And it's got a little long fluttery tail, and its body is made of basically it looks like gel because it lives at such great depths. It doesn't have any body cavities. It doesn't have a swim bladder. It doesn't have a closed skull. It basically, they pull it to the surface, it just I saw a sample of one. It was in a baggie because it needs the pressure to maintain its body form. And it's the cutest, most adorable little fish. I mean, it just looks like a stuffed animal, but it made of gel. And it is the most successful predator in the harshest environment on Earth. It's a pink gummy bear, is the baddest ass animal on the planet.
When I read this, I have an advanced copy, right? So advanced copy doesn't have pictures or anything like that. It's not a final version. I Googled so much from this book. The one you just talked about really stuck in my mind, that when you pull it up to the surface without the pressure, it just becomes jelly. Like it can't hold itself together. It's just the craziest thing ever. So Susan, there is definitely one section of the book towards the end that, well, just scared me a little bit. So I want to talk about deep sea mining. It could be very scary. You scared me in this book. Could you just give me a quick high level? What is it? Why should we be concerned? Tell me all about it.
Yeah. Deep sea mining is not happening yet on an industrial scale, but there are a lot of parties that would like to see it start happening on an industrial scale. And if it does happen, and there are certainly a lot of people who do not want it to happen, I count myself very strongly among them, it will be the largest extractive industry we've ever done, like by an order of magnitude. The area that they're talking about pursuing this area first would be waters beyond national jurisdiction. So the high seas, the seafloor under deep waters that isn't administered by any one country. Any country can go out today and mine on their own continental shelf, but the high seas, which that is 54% of the planet, have not been mined. There was an attempt to do it in the 70s, and it was the metal markets collapsed and it just sort of went away, but it's back. And what they're after are these nodules that grow on the seabed. And by grow, I mean literally like pearls. And they're not like rocks. They're sort of a combination of metals that accrete from seawater and very slowly over millions and millions of years form these nodules. They have nickel, cobalt, manganese, and iron in them. And of course, what people are after is the nickel and cobalt. We got plenty of manganese and iron, and arguably we have enough nickel and cobalt as well. But they sit on the seabed. There's some microbial involvement in creating them, but nobody understands really how they're created. There are animals living inside them, little microorganisms. There are animals that live underneath them in the sediment, which is teeming with microbial and microscopic life that goes way back into deep time. Like it's this vast reservoir of DNA and genomic creativity that the Earth has put forth over eons. So the sediment's not just mud, it's alive. These nodules are not just lumps of metal. They have life inside them, and they're created with a microbial involvement. They would go and basically take all those nodules and scoop up the top layer of the sediment, shoot it up a pipe 3 miles with all the animals. There's a lot of animals sponges and all kinds of animals attached to the hard substrate of these nodules, and they would go up the pipe too. And then they would take the metals, take all the sediment and all the ground up bits of animals and anything else there is, and their plan is to spew that out at right below the twilight zone, which is where all the animals communicate with bioluminescence. And they hunt, they mate, they protect themselves. That's what they use, is this light. And we're going to put a big haze of sediment and nodule debris in there. And the vibration of that and the noise of that is going to drive away other animals in the water column. And we don't know what's down there to begin with. So when we wreck these very large areas, we won't even know what we've lost. But that's the plan, if it's allowed to go ahead, so that we can have a greener future with all this cobalt and nickel to make EV batteries. Well, there's a few problems with that. First of all, the one I just said, we have no idea what we'd even be destroying. Scientists are finding that the area that they're going to mine first is the most biodiverse area that's ever been studied in the deep. A lot of that biodiversity is microbial and microorganisms, so not the charismatic megafauna, but doing some heavy lifting down there and probably some very important things that we don't fully understand. So maybe it would be best not to completely ruin it before we understand it. And the other thing is that each mine site would be 30,000 square miles approximately in this region. So right now there are 19 of them. Countries get these mine sites through the International Seabed Authority, which is an organization that was created by the UN. I won't go into the long, lengthy story of the politics of that, but suffice it to say that, let's just say for the sake of argument, that we do actually one day have to deep sea mine. What scientists recommend is that we take at least 10 years, as long as 30 years even, to find out what the impacts of it would be before we just go ahead and do it. And to me, that seems like a very reasonable argument. And at the same time, we don't know exactly what metals we're going to need in large amounts 5 years from now, because cobalt and nickel are being phased out of EV batteries at this moment. I think it's something like 50% of all EV batteries now are not made with cobalt and nickel. But the price of cobalt isn't even very high right now. Like, we don't really have the imperative to do it right this second, as far as I can tell. And I just think it's a bit of a wisdom test. This is also a huge carbon sink, the deep ocean. And if the microbial functions are disturbed, like, will that affect its ability to take up lots of our excess carbon as it does now? What would we be ruining? It's in a time when we really need to understand things. Like, I think, as I said, if we go ahead and just have at this, we'll be failing a wisdom test. I'm really worried about it.
This definitely seems like the beginning of one of those Armageddon movies, right? Like the first 10 minutes, it's like they did some deep sea mining and then Mother Nature has now decided to kill us. All right, so we're agreed.
Yeah. Wait, let me tell you one other thing too, though. Like, it's often sold as, well, you don't want to tear down the rainforest and child labor in Africa, and all those things are terrible. But if we go ahead and do this, it's not going to replace those things. Like, even if they're allowed to mine all of this area, all of this 2 million square mile area that's basically slated for mining now, is between Mexico and Hawaii, called the Clarion-Clipperton Zone, it will only add about 10 to 15% to the world production of cobalt and something like 4% to the world production of nickel. So it's not going to replace anything. It's just an addition.
All right, Susan, you convinced me. We're not going to do it. I'm going to let everybody know.
Thank you.
We'll knock that
I would
down.
appreciate that.
All right, last question for you.
Okay.
I love this book, right? But there are these poor unfortunate souls that are going to look at this and say, well, there's some history in here and science. No, those are high school classes. I took them. I passed them. I don't ever want to have to read them again. I put one of these people in front of you. They're looking at you with their big eyes and they just say, why should I read this? What would you say to them?
Well, I'm not a scientist. I'm a person who is just incurably curious. And so what I do is I will actually do the heavy lifting for you. I'll go out and I'll hang out with these scientists and I'll download what they're doing. And scientists have some of the best stories on earth. They do amazing stuff. And so I like to bridge their world, and I will come back and put it into a story. We're going to go on a ride when we go into the ocean, and we will learn some science, but you won't even notice that you're learning. By the end of it, you'll have learned and you'll have had an adventure.
Fantastic, Susan. The book is wonderful. Thank you so much for coming on. And that's it for this episode. Susan, thank you so much. The Underworld, go out and buy it. People, trust me. It's for science nerds. It's for history nerds. It's for anybody who likes cool stuff. Trust me. In the meantime, hit us up, Instagram, Twitter, Facebook. We are on Threads. Still figuring that one out, but we'll see. Until next time, stay cool, nerds.